You're listening to a podcast by Way Collective, a contemplative community for love and liberation in Santa Barbara, California. This recording was the conversation starter at our dinner and dialogue gathering on July 16th, 2025. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, I want to invite us into a different kind of conversation. One that I hope transcends the divisive rhetoric of our time, one rooted not in ideology or partisan politics, but in a deeper moral vision, the vision of love that flows from the heart of the Christian tradition. My intention isn't to argue left or right, or red or blue. My intention is to lift up a moral response to the crisis of our time. What is happening at our borders and increasingly within our own communities, the criminalization of immigrants and the militarization of American neighborhoods meant to be places of peace. I want to speak to you not as a politician, but as a contemplative and a minister of the way of connection and compassion, the way of Christ. And I want to ask, what does love require of us now? As Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. And after what happened in our own county in Carpinteria just last Thursday, I cannot stay silent. As many of you know, on July 12th, federal agents from the Department of Homeland Security, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and the National Guard raided Glass House Farms in Carpinteria. At last night's overflowing emergency Santa Barbara City Council meeting, Primi Hernandez, executive director of 805 UndocuFund, shared information from the Public Defender's Office that of the more than 360 people taken in this raid, only 4 had any violent criminal record. 4. Our own U.S. Congressman Salud Carbajal released a statement describing the events, and I saw him there on the front lines himself. He said that agents deployed smoke canisters and fired projectiles into a crowd of peaceful civilians. Witnesses even told him that just before he arrived, a stun grenade was thrown. Several civilians were injured, including a child. Make no mistake, civilians showed up with cell phones, and they were met with military force. My hope is that this contrast stirs something in us, something of our humanity, something of our moral imagination. Violence in any form is an affront to the moral fabric of our society. But when it's wielded unjustly against the vulnerable, it should shake us awake, not into rage, but into love, not into vengeance, but into courage. And again, not in the name of partisan politics, but of basic human decency, of the moral imagination rooted in love. What is moral imagination, you might be wondering? It's the sacred capacity to see the humanity in the other, especially the one our society tells us to fear, ignore, or reject. It refuses to reduce a person to labels like illegal, alien, or threat. Moral imagination asks not, what law did they break, but what burden do they carry? What suffering have they endured? It looks across a border or a barrier and says, you are not a problem to solve, you are a person to behold. The Catholic worker Dorothy Day once said, the legal and the moral are not always the same. And so we ask within our own Christian tradition, is there something higher than the law of the land? I think if you take Jesus seriously at all, at least his words in the Gospels, the answer is unequivocally yes. It's always struck me that Jesus is regularly approached and confronted by what the Gospels call experts in the law. That phrase is a bit on the nose for today, isn't it? The first time they approach him in Matthew, they ask, Teacher, what's the greatest commandment? To which Jesus replies, love God with all your heart and soul and mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law hangs on these two. That's it. That's the higher law. Every other commandment is subservient to this deeper truth. Love comes first. And later in Luke 10, another legal expert comes and asks Jesus, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" Which in first century Jewish language really means, how do I live into God's justice, peace, and compassion now? It wasn't about the afterlife. So Jesus responds with a parable that I know you all know, the Good Samaritan. The point of that story isn't just kindness, it's a radical reframing of the core question we ask. We often ask, who deserves my care, or who belongs within my circle of concern? But Jesus flips it and asks, which of the three was a neighbor? And the answer, of course, is the one who showed mercy. You see, again, when confronted with the law, love is shown to be higher. In our time, agencies like ICE seem to be asking, who deserves to be here? But for those of us trying to walk the way of Jesus, the only question is, how do I become someone who loves those who are here? It's not about who qualifies for love, it's about becoming love in the world. And if that's not clear enough, Jesus gets pretty blunt in Luke 11. He says to the Pharisees, "You clean the outside of the cup, but inside you are full of greed. Be generous to the poor, and everything will be clean for you." And then he says, woe to you because you give a tenth of your yield, like you tithe, nice job, but you neglect justice in the love of God. Now, he could have said, make sure the poor are obeying the rules first and then help them out. But he didn't. He could have said, great job giving to your local church, do that first and then seek justice. But he didn't. Notice with me, justice and love come first. They are the higher priority. Likely agitated by this news, one of the legal experts responds, "Teacher, when you say these things, you insult us, like it hurts our feelings." But Jesus doesn't flinch. He says, woe to you, experts in the law. You load people down with burdens they can hardly carry, and you won't lift a finger to help. Friends, our neighbors are walking around with burdens they can hardly carry. Do you know any of these people? Have you seen them? Are they your neighbors? Many of us in this room, whether white or white passing or just documented citizens of this country, aren't shouldering that same weight. But if we claim to be followers of the way, if we claim a contemplative, ethical, spiritual life, then we must ask, how am I embodying love toward the most vulnerable around me? Author and mystic Howard Thurman once said that to love means to recognize in every other person the same holy root of life that runs through all of us. In our tradition, we call that sacred mystery Christ in us. And that's just our word for it. And I have to say it clearly, the violent detainment, separating of families, and deportation of people in our time is anti-Christ. There is no other word for it. Without belaboring the point too much, the scriptures actually get much more specific than just the command to love. They uplift the necessity of loving the immigrant among us. Leviticus 19 says, "You shall treat the foreigner as a native among you, and you shall love them as yourself, for you were once foreigners in the land of Egypt." Numbers 15 says, "You and the foreigner shall be alike before God." Equality. There is no ambiguity here. The call is clear. Treat the immigrant with dignity as your own kin. And as the United States of America is a nation of immigrants, woe to us if we forget that we were all once foreigners in this land. Just last night, I heard a testimony from a Santa Barbara resident from the UK who just received citizenship after 25 years, 7 of those years undocumented. And when he took his oath, he swore to defend this country from all enemies, foreign and domestic. And then he asked with sincerity, are we now needing to defend ourselves from domestic enemies? Another testimony came from a German-American immigrant and a Santa Barbaran, a friend and colleague of mine, whose grandfather was detained and beaten by the Nazis in 1933, 1937, and 1941. She warned us, history shows us that they come for the immigrants and the most vulnerable first, and then they come for anyone who speaks up. She urged us not to let it happen again. Friends, I want to be clear that I'm not trying to be fatalistic. I'm not interested in fear-mongering. I don't pretend to know how this story will unfold, but I do want to speak the truth in love, and I do believe in hope. Last night, our city council took a step. They voted to research ways to help, including supporting the 805 Undocu Fund, joining legal challenges for those who are detained, and potentially even declaring a state of local mental health emergency. So we too ask, what is ours to do? That's the question I leave with you tonight. I believe in the goodness and decency of every person here, no matter your politics. But if you find your moral compass in the Christian tradition, then let me say it again. The law of love is the culmination of all other laws, and our neighbor, especially the vulnerable one, is our sacred teacher in this. So may we have eyes to see that same holy root of life in those our society tries to cast aside. May we be stirred not into fear, but into a compassion that lives deep in the belly. May we find courage to say no to the systems that crush human dignity, whether those systems wear badges or carry clipboards. And may we remember our policies must never matter more than our people. In our contemplative tradition, hospitality isn't just good manners. It's a sacred act, a holy risk. Making room for the stranger is how we make room for the divine in our midst. To welcome the immigrant is to welcome Christ in disguise. To open our doors is to open our hearts to transformation. Because hospitality isn't charity, it's mutuality. It's not helping from above and reaching down, but standing side by side, because hospitality is solidarity. And in a world building higher walls and stronger fences, enforcing borders with military power, hospitality and nonviolence become prophetic acts. They say with quiet courage, even now you belong, even here, and especially here. Christ once said, "For I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. Truly I tell you, as you did it to one of the least of these, you did it to me." This is the measure of our spirituality. Whether or not we can see the sacred dignity, the image of God in another. To love our neighbor and make peace with them, especially the immigrant, the excluded, all the vulnerable ones, is to align ourselves with the very heartbeat of Christ. To resist violence with nonviolence, to meet fear with welcome, to practice hospitality not as sentiment, but as sacred action. This is our contemplative calling. So may we not turn away. May we not be silent. May we become people whose moral imaginations burn bright enough to see God in the face of the stranger and to act accordingly, with courage, with mercy, and with love. Amen. Tonight, I want to offer us 3 questions for contemplation and conversation. The first question is the self question. How are you feeling in response to the recent ICE raid and the stories shared tonight? What reactions are stirring in you, and what might those feelings be inviting you to notice or do? Number 2, the sacred question. What does it mean to you to see Christ present in the face of the immigrant, the detained, or the deported? How might that reality change the way you see or respond to what's happening around us? And lastly, the society question. Where do you see systems like ICE or others violating the law of love in our society today? And what might solidarity look like for you personally in the face of that reality? Thanks for listening to this podcast by Way Collective. To keep up with our community, you can subscribe to this podcast, go to www.waycollective.org, or follow us on Instagram at @waycollective. Peace and every good, y'all.